much. Hey, everyone. Christina Pretorius. I am the policy director here with Reaching Higher New Hampshire, and joined today by Mark, the school finance administrator at the DOE. We are very excited to be here today to talk about SWEP. So exciting stuff. The network has been really curious about how SWEP works, what it is, all that. So we're really happy to have Mark here to help us break it down a little bit. So in the interest of time, we're going to get going on this, and happy to, have everyone join us. So just a little bit about Reaching Higher New Hampshire. We are a public education policy resource for the state of New Hampshire. We provide analysis, research, context, background for all things ed policy in the state, local, state, and a little bit of federal. With that federal relief funding, we're doing a little bit of work there. But so, our website, reachinghigher.org, we have a lot of great stuff. We do these meetings monthly as well on a range of different topics. And yeah, so today's agenda, we're welcoming you, the New Hampshire Education Network. This is a meeting of that network that meets monthly. So if you're interested, you can sign up. We'll drop a link in the chat soon. And when we send out the recording at the end, we will also, for all of you who aren't a member of the network yet, we'll send out a registration link in case you'd like to be a part of it. So we're going to give an overview of SWEP, and then we'll have some time for discussion and questions. So I'm going to hand it right on over to Mark.
So hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this webinar. Thank you, Reaching Higher, for having us, having the department. I'm Mark Manganiello. I am the administrator of the Office of School Finance within the Department of Education. And since we're talking about SWEP, SWEP is a state policy that the state has. And I just want to maybe set some expectations. It involves the Department of Revenue Administration. It's a tax. So we're gonna be focusing today mostly on how it impacts the school funding formula and school finance. You can get into SWEP, you can get really into the weeds about how your specific tax bill, and I can't really answer those questions. Those are more revenue administration questions. And also the thing about SWEP is when we talk about it, some of it is not super intuitive. So I might be a little bit repetitive. You might know adequacy very well, so you might get it right away. But for those that don't know adequacy very well, even those that know adequacy pretty well, SWEP can be a little complicated, a little less intuitive than you would think about a normal state tax. So it might be a little repetitive, so I apologize if I do repeat myself. But if you look at your tax bill, you're a property taxpayer and you look at your tax bill, some of you might pay an escrow and you don't look at it, but you would likely see your total tax rate. And what's comprised of those total tax rates is 4 taxes. Utilities have their own separate taxes they pay, but if you're a residential taxpayer, you own a home and you pay your taxes, you're going to see 4 taxes. And so those 4 taxes there on the slide, on the screen, municipal property tax, your county property tax, your local education property tax, and your SWEP. And when you look at those first 3, they are local property taxes. They're not a state tax, they're a local property tax. And they serve the same function. So those are property taxes your local governments levy to fund their government. So your municipal government, your police, fire, highway agent, Parks and Rec, et cetera, is going to raise taxes from their local tax base to fund their municipality. Your county is going to fund their courthouse, their sheriff, their nursing home with their property taxes, and your local school is going to fund your schools with their local property taxes. And generally the way that those formulas work are for example, with your local school, you determine as a community how much funding you need to operate your school. So let's say you need $20 million to operate your school. The local property taxpayers are not going to fund every single one of those $20 million. What you're going to do is you're going to say, we need $20 million to fund our school. And then we are going to look to see what we have for state revenue. You will have some state revenue. You might have federal revenue. And then we're going to see what's left. And so if you got $5 million in state and federal revenue or tuition revenue of kids coming into your school, say you got 5 million of that, then you have $15 million left you would need the local taxpayers to pay. So that's how your local property taxes generally would be set, is you need $15 million from the local property taxpayers. So you would apply, you would take that revenue and assess it against the tax base, and that would get you a local education property tax, and that's what you would raise from your local taxpayers. The SWEPT is a little different in the sense the SWEPT is not based on what the local government needs to operate. It's based on what would the state like to raise through SWEPT, and then it applies against all state property taxpayers. So it's a similar formula, but it's a little different. The SWEPT is also a grant to the local school. So the SWEPT is going to show up when local schools are counting their revenue. They expect SWEPT money to come into their schools. And we're going to talk about that and how that SWEPT interacts with local taxes a little bit. So similar to what your the formula, a tax rate formula, essentially, what is the revenue you need to raise over your property tax base? And that gets you a rate. So if we're looking at SWEPT in 22 and then in 23, and some of you might have heard in 23, there is a SWEPT tax cut, a $100 million SWEPT tax cut. So if you look at those two boxes there, you can see in 22, we are going to be raising $363 million through SWEPT, and in 23, only $263 million in SWEPT. So that is the $100 million SWEPT tax cut. But just to see how the SWEPT works, if we look at 22, we as a state under statute want to raise in 22 $363 million through the SWEPT. So we take that $363 million, we apply it against all state property taxpayers, excluding utilities because they pay a separate tax. So we have $199 billion in property tax base. So that turns out to be a rate of $1.82 per thousand. So if you've looked at your local taxes, you might notice your municipal tax is usually in the single digits, your school tax usually in the double digits per thousand. That SWEPT tax is usually a smaller number for most communities, so $1.82 per thousand. Now, if we look in 23, under HB2, we are not raising $363 million like we normally raise. We are only going to be raising $263 million against a $214 billion tax base because property values have been going up. That's the trend, at least. So now that's only $1.23 per thousand. So the SWEPT tax rate is going to be less in 23. And just a little historical information, for the past 10 years or so, the SWEPT has been set around $363 million. So when we had less property values, say 10 years ago, that SWEPT tax rate per thousand used to be like $2.40. So as property values go up, the SWEPT tax rate will naturally decline. So a couple things about SWEPT. If you've been to a education finance committee meeting, you've probably heard the term raised and retained locally. So that is exactly what the SWEPT is. It's a state revenue, but it's also a state expenditure. And what's unique about it as a state revenue is no money actually comes into the state bank account. What's happening is you are paying your taxes to your local tax collector, which is a municipality, and your municipality is paying your school district. But what the state is doing, even though the state has not received the money and the state did not cut a check to your school district, the state is going, we know what the SWEPT is, we know what the local municipality has to raise in revenue, and we are going to record that as if that revenue did come into the state, even though it literally did not come into the state. We'll record that as a revenue. And then when the municipality pays the school district, although the state didn't cut a check, we will record that as a state expenditure to the school district. So that's a part that people sometimes struggle to wrap their head around. They go, how is this a state tax? You guys don't get the dollars. We don't literally get the dollars, but we keep track of the way the money moves. So we record it as a state revenue, even though it actually doesn't go into the state treasury. So it is all raised and retained locally. And so some people like to talk about the different perspectives. So from the state's perspective, we see it as a state tax. It's a state tax we collect as revenue. We pay it as an expenditure. We call them SWEPT grants. What ends up going to the school district. From the school district's perspective, the SWEPT money comes from their municipality to their school district, and it's unrestricted aid for education. So they can spend it on education. They don't have to spend it on a particular program. It comes in just the way like adequacy comes into their school district. So it's an unrestricted state education grant for communities, and they will receive that check from their from their municipality. And so from the property's taxpayer perspective, they might not be parsing through all the different taxes that they have to pay. They would probably perceive it more, it would feel more like the local education property tax, because it's going to the property tax, it's going to the municipal tax collector and going to the school district. So from their mind, they wouldn't see the difference. The locals would know the difference because they know they have no control over the SWEPT. The legislature and the state has control over the SWEPT. So that's kind of the distinctions there from the perspective. So this is the 2023 adequacy formula. And so the reason why SWEPT is important for school finance is because not only is it money for school districts, but it interacts with the adequacy formula. And this part can be a little tricky. And I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but what I want you to pay attention is what is an excess SWEPT community and what is not an excess SWEPT community, because we're going to talk about that. So the way adequacy works, you can see each row, that first row there is base adequacy aid. So for each student in your district that you're responsible for educating, for one student, you get $3,786.66 for that student. That's base adequacy aid. And that's towards calculating the cost of your adequate education. The formula keeps going. If that student is also eligible for free and reduced price meals, so they're within 180% of the poverty line, we also add to calculating your adequate education $1,893.32. We keep looking at the student for more demographic information. If the student has an IEP and receiving SPED services, we would add to calculating the cost of your adequate education $2,037.11. And then we'll also look, is that student an English language learner? If they are, we add $740.87 to the cost of an adequate education. And then lastly, that bottom row of the first section is if the student is in third grade, they scored below proficient on the third grade reading test, and that student is not eligible for free and reduced price meals, not receiving SPED services, not an English language learner, then we add $740.87 to the cost of an adequate education when we're tallying up all the students. So we end up, you probably have more than just one student. You probably have dozens and hundreds of thousands of students in your district. So when we add up all those numbers and do that math and make that calculation, we determine what is that first green bar, green box there, the cost of an adequate education. So just to keep the math easy, if we tallied up all the students in your district, say your cost of an adequate education was $1 million. What that means is the state needs to provide funding so that you have, at a minimum, the cost of what the state has defined as an adequate education. So if we've determined from the state's perspective, your adequate education is $1 million, before I cut you a check, I'm not just going to give you a check for $1 million. The state is not going to. We're going to look to see how much did you raise through your SWEPT. So if your community, by applying that $1.82 tax rate, you raised, say, $500,000 through your property taxpayers, and the cost of an adequate education is $1 million, but you raised $500,000 through SWEPT, well, then you need $1 million. So the state needs to cut you a check for $500,000, which would be called an adequacy grant. So the way we kind of talk about the two different ways is that first $500,000 from your municipal taxpayer, that would be your SWEPT grant that you receive from the state. And then the next $500,000, which would be the check the state cuts for you, that would be $500,000 in adequacy grant. So that's most communities. Most communities, the cost of an adequate education is less than what they receive through the SWEPT. But there are some communities that are called excess SWEPT communities. And a community like that might have a lot of property value. So when you apply that $1.80 tax rate to their high property values, they might bring in $2 million to their community. So if in that community, the cost of an adequate education is $1 million, but the SWEPT is $2 million, then they have $1 million, we call it excess SWEPT, above the cost of an adequate education. And if you've heard the term donor town, though 10 years ago, what used to happen is if there was money raised, or if there was SWEPT money above and beyond the cost of an adequate education, the state would take that money. And that money would be used to fund education for other districts. So they used to call those communities donor towns. Sometimes they still call them donor towns. There's no such thing as a donor town because there's no donation occurring. What's happening is that $2 million is being raised through the SWEPT. Their cost of an adequate education is $1 million, but they get to keep that full $2 million. So there's no donation there's no money going to the state. So that's an old term, but people still use it. probably the more accurate term or jargon would be to call them an excess swept community. They have swept above and beyond the cost of an adequate education. And so that's been a part of the formula for 10 years or so. There's a couple, the formula for 23 for adequacy is not finished. First, if you are a stabilization town, so your town received a stabilization grant in 2012, you could potentially be eligible for receiving that grant in addition to your adequacy grant. There's a new grant starting this year in 22, but also existing in 23 called Relief Aid. And that's based on the percentage of FNR population in your community. If you have an FNR population percentage above 12%, you're potentially eligible to receive this Relief Aid grant, which is above and beyond your adequacy money. But the thing we're talking about here that's a little confusing is there's this swept reduction hold harmless grant. So like we talked about earlier, the swept is going to be raising less money. Everyone's going to be having that $1.20 or so tax rate being applied to their tax base. So let's talk about that excess swept community. So that excess swept town that we did in the hypothetical that has $2 million in swept coming in, but their cost of an adequate education is $1 million. Let's say we apply that new swept tax rate that's a lot lower. It's about 60 cents lower. Say that only brings in $1.5 million. So they were normally raising and retaining $2 million through the swept. Now they're only raising and retaining $1.5 million through their swept. So the way HB2 has been designed is there's a whole swept hold harmless. So any money you're losing, any money an excess swept town is losing because of a reduction in their swept, it will be made up with a swept hold harmless grant. So to bring them back up to the 2 million, the state will be paying $500,000 in cutting a check for $500,000 in a swept hold harmless grant. And we'll go through that. It's a little complicated. We'll go through a couple examples of explaining that later in the presentation. So I think one of the big concerns people had when they heard that swept was being reduced was that they know that swept money results in school funding. So they wanted to know what was going to happen. So if you look at the way swept works, swept is a state revenue, but it's also a state expenditure. So on the state perspective side, swept is 363 million. We reduce it by 100 million. Well, we reduce revenue by 100 million, but we also reduced expenditures by 100 million. So it's a net zero impact to the state. But from the locals' perspective, they were receiving 360 million in state grants, state swept grants. Now they're only receiving 263 million. So their initial reaction, if you say someone's cutting swept, your initial concern might be, well, we need that money. That is actually money for our schools. And so before calculating adequacy in the hold harmless grant, it would be a $100 million reduction in school funding. But the way it's going to work with the adequacy formula and the language in HB2 to do a swept hold harmless grant, the swept revenue will be reduced by 100 million. So the state will have a saving in revenue, a decrease in revenue and a decrease in expenditure, so a net zero impact. But and when we were talking about that formula, if your cost of an adequate education is $1 million and your swept normally is $500,000, but your community now is raising less through swept. So say your adequacy is $1 million, your swept is $500,000, but we've had this swept cut. So now your swept is only $250,000. I need to pay you now $750,000. So I need to pay you an additional $250,000 so that you have the adequate education. And so when we tally that up statewide, that approximately equals $85 million as far as increased adequacy aid. Then we talk about those excess swept communities. That excess swept community example of a community that's adequacy is $1 million, their cost of an adequate education is $1 million, their swept is $2 million, they've received a swept cut maybe of 500,000, so they now only have 1.5 coming in for swept. We need to pay them 500,000 in a swept hold harmless grant. When we look at that statewide, that tallies to about 15 million. And so what is the net result? Well, the state has paid an extra $100 million. But if you look at the local side, the locals first lost 100 million in swept revenue, but the local school districts have made it up in adequacy grants and swept hold harmless grants. So their net change is zero, but the state has paid an additional $100 million to supplant that swept reduction revenue decrease. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So there's basically three scenarios of how this can work with the school funding formula. So most communities are non-excess swept communities. So basically, as their swept decreases, their adequacy grant increases. So if we have in this district, their cost of inadequate education is 22 million, their swept is only 5 million. And as you can see there, that's their swept under the new tax rate, the reduced tax rate. Well, their adequacy grant needs to be 17 million. But if I looked at what their swept was under the old system, it was $7 million. So really, under the old system, I was paying them a $15 million adequacy grant, and they were getting $7 million in swept. So they had 22 million. Now I'm paying them 17 million in adequacy grant. So what is the net impact to the school district? Well, they are going to receive $22 million regardless, whether swept was cut or not, they're receiving $22 million. But what is the net impact to the taxpayer? That community got essentially a $2 million property tax cut. So that's really this formula, this tax cut relates to school funding because it interacts with school funding and it's part of the school funding formula. But kind of at the end of the day, the net impact is it's a property tax cut. So that's kind of the takeaway, or one way to think about this. There's probably a lot of ways to think about it. So the other example here is the excess swept school district, and they receive a new hold harmless grant, which is new to 2023, a swept reduction hold harmless grant. So in this example, their cost of inadequate education is 2 million. Their swept is 4.5 million under the new reduced swept rate. Their adequacy grant is $0 because they already have enough money to fund their adequate education. They have 4.5 million from their swept. But if we look at the swept tax cut and see how much they would have got if no swept tax cut had occurred otherwise, it was 6.5 million. So we need to pay them a $2 million hold harmless grant. So same situation. What is the net impact of the school district? Well, they get 6.5 million regardless. What is the net impact to the taxpayer? Well, they received a $2 million swept hold harmless grant. So that's essentially a $2 million tax cut because they received a swept $2 million hold harmless grant, and they have $2 million less in swept revenue that their taxpayers have to pay. And then the third sort of, this is maybe only a district or two, is some people are kind of on the bubble and they're a little bit of both. So in this scenario, the cost of inadequate education is $3 million. Their new swept is 2.5 million. So historically, this community might have been an excess swept community, but now for the first time, or at least new to this year, they are not an excess swept community. So they would need an adequacy grant. But in addition to their adequacy grant, if we look at their swept, if the tax cut had not occurred, their old swept was 3.5 million. So we need to pay them 0.5 million in adequacy grants, but we also need to pay them $500,000 in a swept hold harmless. And what is the net result? Well, their old swept was 3.5 million, so they received 3.5 million regardless. So it's no impact on their funding. Essentially, they're getting $1 million tax cut because they have $1 million less in swept revenue that this community is raising had we used the old rates. So the next question is, okay, I can see that the state is paying $100 million to do this tax cut. How is that being funded? So I can't tell you exactly how it's going to be funded, like with a precise breakdown, because I don't know the future. And I also don't have a pie chart of the 2023 estimates, but essentially what the legislature is estimating for 2023, this is a pie chart of 2020 from the CAFR, from the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. But essentially what the legislature is estimating in 2023 is they think the business taxes are going to be doing substantially well, that they can still raise the approximately $1 billion that they need in the ETF while reducing swept revenue by $100 million. So you can see in the gray pie chart there, swept is about 37% of the ETF. That pie chart is going to shrink. So the swept is going to be probably 28% of the ETF. I'm just throwing out a ballpark number there. And you're going to see the other parts of the pie chart. So lottery commission revenue, business taxes, they're going to expand. Their pies are going to expand while the swept shrinks. So that's what the legislature is predicting. They're predicting they can afford a reduction in swept revenue because business taxes will make up that reduction. And so that's essentially how the swept tax cut is going to work.
All right. Hey, thanks, Mark. Really awesome. Lots of good stuff. And so I just have a couple of things here. So this was the swept tax cut, that $100 million that we've been talking about. But something else that our network members, lawmakers, other people who are interested in school funding have been talking about is the fiscal capacity disparity aid, which provided about, was it about $47 million, the one that ended in 2021, that was targeted to districts with lower property tax bases. They were sort of, that phased out in June. And the lawmakers had put in this $100 million tax cut for 2023. There was a lot of conversation at the State House around where the funding goes, what does that look like? And for 48 communities, the amount of fiscal capacity disparity aid, since that was targeted to those towns with low property tax bases, they received less, quote, what we would consider tax relief from that swept reduction than they would have under if fiscal capacity disparity aid were to continue. So where swept provided about 60 cents per $1,000 in tax relief for every property taxpayer in the state, it was a universal tax cut just right off the top. Fiscal capacity disparity aid provided targeted relief. So there are 3 districts here that I just sort of plucked out from an LBA spreadsheet and from our own analysis back at the last budget session, where in Derry, the amount of aid that they got, they're receiving about $1.6 million less in relief. So they had whatever they had for fiscal capacity disparity aid, that was replaced with this swept tax cut. And so that difference is about $1.6 million. For Northumberland, that fiscal capacity disparity aid provided about $8.81 per thousand in tax relief. The swept provides about 60 cents per thousand. And these numbers, I do want to emphasize that these numbers, that tax relief is from our previous analysis about the budget. And that assumes that all of that fiscal capacity disparity aid went to property tax relief. We know that some districts used it for budgeting, that kind of thing. But if we're trying to compare the tax cuts and for discussion purposes, that's sort of what our analysis found. And that had been a pretty substantial conversation throughout the session, throughout the budget session. And so, what does that look like now? And I think a lot of, if you're a network member, if you've been following Reaching Higher, you probably have seen this graphic before, but it just compares communities and that trade-off between fiscal capacity disparity aid and that swept tax reduction. So in somewhere like Derry, where the average home value is $385,000, this $100 million swept tax cut would provide them with $192 in savings through that 60 cent per thousand tax reduction. But they were getting about $358 in property tax relief through fiscal capacity disparity aid. So the difference there is $166 less in property tax relief, assuming that fiscal capacity disparity aid went to property tax relief. So there are about 48 communities where that occurs. And that has been, the Senate Education Committee met this morning, and one of the committee members had talked about bringing forth legislation that would sort of provide a hold harmless for those 48 communities for about $22 million. It did not go forward in committee, but we're expecting that to perhaps come back next session. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, we are going to look at this swept tax reduction. And so from here, we'll take some questions. If you can drop them in the chat and I will read them to Mark. Hopefully he can help us answer some questions.
So right before you get into that, Christina, I had a direct message question, and I hope you don't mind if I ask it. It was the first one off the top.
Sure.
So the question is, what is the rationale or benefit to the raised and retained locally part of SWEPT? Why isn't it collected at the state level like other taxes? Thanks.
It's really just I guess you can always put the pros and cons list to everything, or find. But really, it's raised and retained because there is no. If it was not raised and retained and it went to the state, I guess you could. There would be donor towns again. So it has to be 100% retained. If it is not 100% retained and any is taken to the state and not given back to that community, then the concept of donor towns would exist again. So being 100% raised and retained means there's no possibility that there could be a donor town.
Thanks. Christina, do you want me to keep going with the reading, or is that something you'd like to do?
Yeah, if you want to keep going, because we've been sharing a computer, so I know you've been keeping tabs on it, so that'd be great.
Yeah, I have. Okay, cool. So we have another question that says, what's the benefit of reducing SWEPT and increasing adequacy aid? And they put there's sort of like another question with it. In the end, isn't it still all just New Hampshire taxpayer money, regardless of which line item it comes out of?
So
I can repeat that too if you need me to.
You can a dollar is a dollar. So a dollar if it comes from SWEPT, or if it comes from, you could definitely have that conversation. If it comes from SWEPT, is it coming from a taxpayer? Property taxpayer could be coming from a business. So you can definitely decide where you want to get your revenue. So you might want to get your revenue from businesses. You want to get them from property taxpayers. That's certainly a conversation people can have and weigh the pros and cons. The SWEPT, and I can't speak to the intent. I wasn't involved in working with the representative who came up with the SWEPT tax cut, but I believe, I can't speak to their intent, but really it's just a way to, from the state's perspective, to ensure a property tax cut occurs, because we can't control, the state doesn't really control local budgets. It's a local decision on how you want to spend your money. Do you want to give tax relief, or do you want to grow your budget? So I think probably the intent behind it was this was a guaranteed way to cut property taxes. But like we've talked about, it is flat. So it is a across the board property tax cut, because that is the only way the SWEPT tax, or at least in this legislation, the only way it could have worked.
Thank you very much. Okay, so our next question is, how long are the SWEPT hold harmless grants guaranteed for?
That is a good question. So this, and I didn't mention that in my presentation, so thank you for bringing that up. The SWEPT reduction is 1 year, so it's one time. And the SWEPT reduction hold harmless is also one time. So this is not changing statute. Right now under current law, 2024 will go back to $363 million SWEPT. So that is a very good question. Thank you for bringing that up and reminding me.
Thank you. So I'm sure that this was addressed already in your presentation, but if there's a question that pops up, it's always worth asking. Where does the adequacy money come from is our next question.
So yeah, it comes from the Education Trust Fund. So, and that's the Education Trust Fund is about $1 billion. It's consistently stays in around $1 billion. And the way adequacy works is that SWEPT is 100% received from the state, 100% goes back out to the school districts, at least on our ledgers. You know, we talked about how money doesn't actually come to the state, but the Education Trust Fund funds adequacy. So we have about $1 billion there, about 336. I don't have the math in front of me, but 360 or so is from SWEPT. About 600+ million is coming from business taxes, tobacco tax, meal and rentals tax, lottery. So some of those business taxes, that money would have gone to the general fund, but the way DRA receives it is they divert a little bit to education, and that little bit goes into education, and it's just a bucket for money to be received in to go towards education. But if the Education Trust Fund ever did not have enough money to pay for adequacy, the general fund you'd have to transfer money from the general fund to the Education Trust Fund to fund adequacy. So basically, state dollars fund adequacy. There's a lot of different revenue sources that are coming in, but the Education Trust Fund is where the money comes from.
Excellent. Actually, that kind of leads into our next question about how there have been business tax cuts applied. Should we expect to see an increase in revenue from those categories is the question.
So I can't answer that question. So when the Department of Education isn't involved in revenue estimates. So if you're curious about revenue estimates, you could talk to the Department of Revenue Administration. You could spend some time with Ways and Means and talk. Ways and Means are the ones who come up with, if you're curious, they're the ones who make those calls. They look at what revenue's coming in and they come up with a plan. They might cut taxes and they come up with a plan on if they cut taxes, do they think what they think the impact will be on the revenues. So I can't answer that question. I actually am not knowledgeable about that.
I will say I'm going to put in a plug here for the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. They did a lot of really great work throughout the session in following the work of Ways and Means in the modeling of the revenue. So once we send out the recording, there are a couple of policy briefs that we're happy to include in the email.
We have a lot of questions coming in that are sort of rhetorical and just sort of like very general, like posturing around what SWEPT can be a very divisive topic for people, depending on your perception of the way that it is collected and distributed. So as opposed to sort of posing rhetoricals, I'm going to get to some of the more nitty-gritty questions. One of these is what percentage of lottery money actually goes to the schools, not the tax rate, and how much of that revenue goes to schools. And it's convenient that you're on the slide.
So lottery is actually one of the unique funding sources because it's the only funding source that constitutionally has to be spent on education. And so the way the Lottery Commission works is they run their gaming, they run their administration, they run the commission, and any profits they get from gaming goes to education. So it turns out to be around $100 million. So $100 million, the $100 million profit that lottery gets, I don't know their full budget. They have to pay for if someone wins a lottery game or whatever, they have to pay all the technical things that they have to pay for. They have to pay for their administration, but all net profits constitutionally are required to go to education. And so that all those profits end up in the Education Trust Fund, and all money in the Education Trust Fund goes toward education. So I can't actually divvy out and say how much is that. I think I know what your question is the SWEPT is being reduced. So how much of lottery is funding that reduction? I can't give you that number, but I guess theoretically, if you do the math, someone could come up with that number.
Absolutely. There's a lot of, if folks have questions that we can't answer, we would love for you to follow up with an email and we can absolutely connect you to the folks that do have those answers. Like Christina had mentioned, the Fiscal Policy Institute is a great resource for statistics and all kinds of awesome things. They're a great resource. So we have a couple of questions that I'm going to condense into one. What is the purpose of this new SWEPT tax formula? There's several variations of that question, but what is the goal of this SWEPT restructuring recently?
So I think I can't speak for, I wasn't in the State House for every deliberation on this issue, but I think the goal was to make sure, because when we talk about to make sure it has a net, I believe the goal was to make sure it has a net zero impact on school funding. So no one loses, because what would happen if you reduced even if you're an excess SWEPT town and you reduced your SWEPT revenue, you would have to either do two things: cut your local school budget or raise your local education property tax. So I believe the goal was to make it net neutral on school funding, which it is. It has no impact on the schools. They'll receive whatever they were going to receive otherwise if there was no tax cut. And I think that the legislature and I can't speak for them, they have to speak for themselves, but I think they just wanted to do a property tax cut and they wanted to have no impact on excess SWEPT communities and non-excess SWEPT communities.
That's a great explanation. Thank you. So there's another question asking about the voucher program, also known as education freedom accounts. Someone wants to know, does the money for the voucher program come from SWEPT or adequacy funds? And that might be a question for, I mean, either of you could answer it.
So SWEPT is 100% going to local public school districts. So it's not, SWEPT money is already, it's paid. That's a good question. It comes from the municipality, goes to the school district. EFAs are going to be paid, education freedom accounts will be paid from the education trust fund, but they will not, I think an important thing to think about, it's not the way the adequacy, and we didn't go into too much detail about the adequacy formula works, but if you are a public district public school and you are responsible for educating a student, you receive adequacy funding for that student. If that student were to leave your school district and take an EFA, then you would have less adequacy funding because you are not responsible for educating that student anymore. But it's not coming from adequacy. A school district is paid adequacy based on the cost of their adequate education. But yeah, I think that might answer the question.
I think it does. Yeah. And we have another question that came in about the SWEPT hold harmless. The communities that are receiving the hold harmless funding, would they then be losing funding if the grants go away next year?
They would be losing funding if the grants went away and the SWEPT tax cut remained, but that's not going to happen. Both are expiring under current law. Both are expiring in 2023. The tax cut and the SWEPT hold harmless grant.
Oh my goodness, we have so many questions.
This is great.
I know.
Loving this.
Yeah. Let me see. Another question coming in about the fiscal capacity disparity aid is being eliminated. And you showed us a slide where poorer towns will not receive enough from SWEPT to cover the fiscal disparity aid amount. Why is that? Is the question.
So there are two different, yeah, I think we talked a little bit about that. The fiscal capacity disparity aid is targeted to property poor towns. It's based on your equalized valuation over your pupils, which tends to benefit. It's either benefits towns that have a lot of students or towns that have really poor property, low property values. So the fiscal capacity disparity aid was more targeted than the SWEPT. The SWEPT was a flat, sort of across the board. I think the number is 28. It's about a 28% tax cut off your SWEPT, where fiscal capacity disparity aid was looking at a couple things. It was looking at your equalized valuation, your number of your students, and creating a metric, and then distributing aid on a scaled basis on the lower your equalized valuation per pupil. So either the lower your property values, the more aid you got through fiscal capacity disparity aid, where SWEPT is kind of across the board flat tax cut.
Okay, so here's an interesting question. Who determines the value of adequate education funding in New Hampshire and how?
So the legislature through state laws ultimately, and with or without the governor's pen. So it's all determined in state law. What is adequacy? It's the legislature's responsibility. The only thing the department does is we count all the kids and do the math and run the spreadsheets and cut the checks or send the money to the treasury to cut the checks. But really the legislature is responsible for determining adequacy.
I'll jump in here and say that Reaching Higher, personal plug here, has a school funding video that sort of walks you through that. And we have a very recent podcast, two-part podcast that goes through the history, the Claremont rulings, and really how we got to this point. It is a very complex story, and we'd be happy to send those links as well. But he's totally right. It's all lawmakers.
Well, sometimes, yeah, that's right. The courts can, the courts have a role to play because and I'm sure the podcast will go into this, and I'll have to give it a listen. the Constitution says that the New Hampshire must cherish education, which the courts have said that means you must provide an adequate education, and that's the whole history of adequacy. That's how that term adequacy comes to exist. It actually doesn't exist in the Constitution. The Constitution says cherish education.
Excellent, thank you. So there is a recurring question: why should the collection and distribution of SWEPT be any different than any other New Hampshire tax?
So really, the reason why it is structured the way it is currently is to eliminate the concept of donor counts. So if it were to go back to the state, technically we could get rid of donor counts, or we could not have donor counts and just have all the money come into the state, and then we could send out the check. So I guess it's more administratively efficient for the municipality to cut the check, I guess. Maybe, I don't know. But really, the reason why it's all raised and retained locally is to end the concept of donor counts.
Hey, thank you, Maggie, for throwing that into the chat. I was trying to go through the chat and get to our website at the same time, and as usual, Maggie's on top of it.
Thanks, Maggie.
Yeah, she's the best. Oh, and Carl is asking about the video. So the two-part podcast that Christina mentioned, the second part just launched today. So there's two parts around the Claremont decision and the broad history of where, you know, the conversation started and where we are now. It's very in-depth, and you can all imagine it's very convoluted to say the least, as you know, the law can be sometimes. I'm seeing that we're sort of at the pinnacle of question asking. If you have any other questions, please take the time to enter them into the chat. We've got about like 10 more minutes. But if that's where the questions end, we will be sharing this recording with you later. We share all of our network meeting recordings, so you'll be able to see this. And if you have any questions about, you know, public education in New Hampshire, we have some excellent resources on our website. So after you check out that awesome video and that amazing podcast series, go ahead and explore our website. There's so much content there. We really pride ourselves on making complex ideas and documentation easy for people to understand and share within their community. All right, I think I'm seeing that we're at the end of question asking. I would very much like to thank the Department of Ed for joining us today and for taking the time to explain this really difficult conversation to everybody. You've done an exceptional job, so thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's always such a pleasure. I am going to throw a link in the chat for everyone so that November 8th is our next meeting. So we always are at the same time. It's 3 to 4. I'm going to copy the invitation now, and I'm going to throw that in the chat. And don't worry, if you are a part of our network, then you will be getting all kinds of updates about when our next meetings are. If you would like to join the network, you can find access to that on our website, as well as through our weekly education news roundup. So hope that we will catch you in one of those places. And thank you, Christina, for sharing the contact page. You can reach out to any member of Reaching Higher New Hampshire. We love to hear from you all, and we love to talk about education. So don't hesitate to reach out to anyone on this list. Thank you all. We're going to call that a meeting. What do you say?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Thanks so
y'all.
much.
Oh,
Bye.
thank you. Bye, Maggie. Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah. Christina, you can feel free to call it a day.
Sounds good. Will do.